She stood in my garden with the radiance of someone who believed she'd already won. Her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around a glass of my best wine as she complimented the roses I'd spent 3 years nurturing. Vanessa Hartwell smiled at me with the kind of warmth that could fool anyone into believing she genuinely cared, her emerald dress catching the afternoon sunlight as she laughed at something my husband had whispered in her ear just moments before. What she didn't know was that in exactly 23 minutes, my brother Daniel would walk through that wrought-iron gate, and the confident expression she wore like armor would shatter into pure terror. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special I can't wait to share. My name is Sophia Blackwood, and I'm about to tell you how one seemingly innocent garden party became the moment when 3 years of carefully hidden lies exploded in the most spectacular way imaginable. But this isn't just about discovering my husband's affair. This is about uncovering a web of deception so complex, so calculated, that it involved not just my marriage, but my family's darkest secret, and a woman whose past was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. I'm 34 years old, a successful landscape architect who owns Blackwood Garden Designs here in the affluent town of Willowmere Springs, about an hour north of Charlotte. Until 6 months ago, I thought I understood exactly who I was, who my family was, and what my life represented. I was the woman who could transform any outdoor space into something magical, the wife who supported her husband's political ambitions, and the sister who'd always protected her younger brother Daniel from the consequences of his more reckless decisions. My husband, Jonathan Blackwood, had been the golden boy of Willowmere Springs since we'd moved here 8 years ago. At 37, he was everything this conservative, wealthy community wanted in a leader. Tall, distinguished, with steel-gray eyes and the kind of commanding presence that made people automatically defer to his judgment. He'd built a successful consulting firm, Blackwood Strategic Solutions, that specialized in helping businesses navigate complex regulatory environments. More importantly, he'd positioned himself as the inevitable next mayor of Willowmere Springs, with elections just 4 months away. Our home on Magnolia Ridge Drive was the kind of place that appeared in Southern Living magazine, a sprawling colonial revival with wraparound porches and gardens that I'd designed to showcase every season. It was the perfect backdrop for the political entertaining that had become central to our lives, the ideal setting for a power couple who seemed to have everything figured out. But as I stood there watching Vanessa Hartwell charm my guests at what was supposed to be an intimate gathering for Jonathan's campaign donors, I knew that everything beautiful about our life was built on foundations that were about to crumble. The woman laughing so naturally with my neighbors, the woman who'd been coming to our events for the past 8 months as a strategic communications consultant, was sleeping with my husband. What made it infinitely worse was that she had no idea I'd discovered their affair 3 weeks ago. What made it absolutely devastating was what I'd learned about her connection to my family just yesterday. Vanessa Hartwell wasn't just Jonathan's mistress. She was the woman whose testimony had sent my brother Daniel to prison for vehicular manslaughter 5 years ago. The same Daniel who'd served his time, rebuilt his life, and was supposed to arrive at our party this afternoon to publicly reconcile with the family that had stood by him through his darkest period. The same Daniel who had no idea that the woman who'd destroyed his life was now systematically destroying mine. The irony was so perfect it felt orchestrated by some malevolent deity with a taste for poetic justice. Vanessa had spent months positioning herself as the ideal woman to help Jonathan's political career, all while conducting an affair that could destroy everything he'd worked for. She'd attended our dinner parties, complimented my cooking, even offered advice about handling the challenges of being married to an ambitious man. She'd looked me in the eye dozens of times while lying about who she was and what she wanted. But today, in exactly 23 minutes, when Daniel walked through that gate expecting to find family support and community acceptance, Vanessa Hartwell would come face to face with the young man whose life she'd helped destroy. The young man who'd spent 5 years in prison partly because of her testimony. The young man who had no idea that his sister had discovered not just her husband's betrayal, but the true identity of the woman who'd been systematically infiltrating their lives. I'd spent 3 weeks planning this moment with the same meticulous attention to detail I brought to designing award-winning gardens. Every element had been carefully considered, from the guest list to the timing, from the seating arrangements to the exact moment when Daniel would make his entrance. Vanessa believed she was attending a routine political gathering where she could continue playing her role as Jonathan's trusted advisor while secretly planning their future together. Instead, she was about to discover that some secrets are impossible to bury, that some lies are too complex to maintain, and that some people are far more dangerous when they appear to be perfectly controlled. The woman who thought she'd manipulated her way into the perfect life was about to learn that she'd walked into a trap 3 weeks in the making. The garden party was about to become a reckoning that would expose not just an affair, but a conspiracy that reached back years and involved crimes that went far beyond adultery. And it would all begin the moment my brother Daniel walked through that gate, and Vanessa Hartwell realized that her past had finally caught up with her present. The stage was set. The players were in position. And in 22 minutes and counting, everything would change forever. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you, so if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. All right, let's get back to it. Growing up in the small mountain town of Cedar Ridge, North Carolina, I learned early that appearances could be deceiving and that the most beautiful gardens often required the darkest soil. My mother, Vanessa Blackwood, had taught me that strength wasn't about avoiding storms, but about learning how to dance in the rain while planning for sunshine. She'd raised Daniel and me as a single mother after our father died in a construction accident when I was 12 and Daniel was 9. And she'd instilled in both of us the understanding that family loyalty wasn't just important, it was everything. I'd channeled that lesson into building Blackwood garden designs from the ground up, starting with small residential projects and gradually earning the trust of Willowmere Springs' elite through sheer determination and an eye for transforming ordinary spaces into extraordinary sanctuaries. My portfolio included some of the most prestigious properties in 3 counties, and my reputation for discretion and reliability had made me the go-to landscape architect for clients who valued both beauty and privacy. The success of my business had been crucial when Jonathan and I decided to make Willowmere Springs our home 8 years ago. Jonathan had been recruited by the mayor at the time, Richard Pemberton, who'd seen potential in a young consultant with fresh ideas about economic development and strategic planning. The town was experiencing rapid growth as wealthy families from Charlotte sought refuge in smaller communities, and Jonathan's expertise in navigating complex business relationships had quickly made him indispensable to local government. Our marriage had been built on mutual respect and shared ambitions. We'd met during my final year at NC State's landscape architecture program when Jonathan was completing his MBA. He'd been confident without being arrogant, intelligent without being condescending, and he'd possessed the rare ability to make everyone around him feel heard and valued. When he proposed after 2 years of dating, I'd believed I was marrying not just a man I loved, but a true partner who would support my dreams while pursuing his own. For the first 6 years of our marriage, that belief had seemed justified. Jonathan had encouraged my business expansion, celebrated my professional achievements, and never once suggested that my success threatened his masculinity or ambitions. When I landed the contract to redesign the gardens at Willowmere Springs Country Club, he'd been prouder than I was. When my work was featured in Southern Living, he'd framed the article and hung it in his office. But politics had changed him in ways I'd been slow to recognize. The transition from behind-the-scenes consultant to public figure had awakened something in Jonathan that I didn't entirely recognize. The man who'd once been content to solve problems quietly had developed a taste for applause, for recognition, for the kind of power that came with elected office. His announcement that he intended to run for mayor had surprised me, not because he lacked the qualifications, but because he'd never shown interest in being the center of attention, rather than the power behind it. My brother Daniel's situation had complicated everything in ways that extended far beyond family dynamics. 5 years ago, Daniel had been a 25-year-old construction supervisor with a bright future and a serious drinking problem he'd refused to acknowledge. The accident that changed everything had happened on a rainy Thursday evening when Daniel, driving home from a job site after what he later admitted was a few beers with his crew, had struck and killed Margaret Chen, a 63-year-old, retired teacher who'd been crossing Main Street in downtown Asheville. The legal proceedings had been a nightmare that consumed our family for months. Daniel's blood alcohol level had been just above the legal limit, but not significantly so. The rain had reduced visibility, and Mrs. Chen had been wearing dark clothing. Daniel's defense attorney had argued that the accident would have been unavoidable regardless of Daniel's sobriety level, but the prosecution had painted him as a reckless drunk driver who'd shown complete disregard for public safety. The case had hinged largely on eyewitness testimony, and the prosecution's star witness had been a young woman named Vanessa Hartwell, who'd been working late at a downtown law firm and claimed to have seen the entire incident from her office window. Her testimony had been detailed, compelling, and ultimately devastating to Daniel's defense. She'd described his driving as erratic in the minutes before the accident, claimed he'd been speeding significantly, and testified that he'd shown no attempt to brake or swerve to avoid Mrs. Chen. Daniel had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for vehicular manslaughter, and our family had been shattered by the combination of grief, guilt, and the financial devastation of legal fees. Jonathan had been supportive during those dark months, helping me navigate the emotional complexity of loving a brother who'd made a terrible mistake while grieving for an innocent woman who'd lost her life. But as Jonathan's political ambitions had crystallized, Daniel's criminal record had become what he carefully termed a complication. Not something that would prevent Jonathan from winning, but something that required strategic management and careful messaging. The narrative had become that Jonathan Blackwood was a man who understood both personal responsibility and family loyalty, someone who'd stood by his wife during her family's darkest hour while never compromising his commitment to justice and accountability. It was a compelling story that had served Jonathan well during the early stages of his campaign. The voters of Willowmere Springs appreciated a candidate who embodied both strength and compassion, someone who could navigate complex moral terrain without abandoning his principles. Jonathan had positioned himself as exactly that kind of leader, and his polling numbers had reflected the community's respect for his handling of a difficult situation. What I hadn't realized until 3 weeks ago was that Jonathan's commitment to strategic messaging extended far beyond his public persona. The man I'd married, the man I'd trusted with my heart and my dreams, had been conducting a months-long affair with the very woman whose testimony had sent my brother to prison. The woman who'd helped destroy Daniel's life was now positioned to share in the political success that Daniel's conviction had, ironically, helped make possible. The perfect symmetry of it was almost artistic in its cruelty. Vanessa Hartwell had helped send Daniel to prison, then positioned herself to benefit from the political capital that Jonathan had gained by standing by his family during their crisis. She'd testified about Daniel's recklessness and poor judgment, then seduced the man who'd married Daniel's sister. She'd helped create the very narrative that was now propelling Jonathan toward the mayor's office, while simultaneously conducting an affair that could destroy everything he'd worked to achieve. As I stood in my garden watching her charm my guests, I couldn't help but admire the audacity of it all, even as it filled me with a rage so pure it was almost clarifying. Vanessa Hartwell had entered our lives 8 months ago, like a perfectly timed answer to prayers we hadn't even known we were making. Jonathan's campaign manager, Rebecca Torres, had recommended her as a strategic communications consultant with an impressive track record of helping political newcomers navigate the complex media landscape of North Carolina politics. Her credentials were impeccable: a master's degree in communications from Duke University, 5 years of experience with a prestigious Charlotte-based political consulting firm, and a portfolio of successful campaigns that included 2 congressional races and a gubernatorial primary that had defied all polling predictions. From the moment she walked into our first strategy meeting at the Willowmere Springs Country Club, Vanessa had commanded attention in a way that seemed effortless but was clearly the result of years of careful cultivation. She was 31 years old, with the kind of polished beauty that suggested both natural gifts and significant investment in maintaining them. Her auburn hair was always perfectly styled, whether she was presenting campaign strategies in our dining room or attending casual fundraising events at local businesses. She dressed with the calculated precision of someone who understood that every outfit was a form of communication, favoring jewel tones that complemented her green eyes and tailored pieces that conveyed both professionalism and approachability. But it was her intellectual presence that had initially impressed both Jonathan and me. Vanessa didn't just understand political messaging. She grasped the deeper psychological currents that drove voter behavior in communities like Willowmere Springs. She could articulate why a particular demographic would respond to specific themes about economic development, while simultaneously explaining how to frame those same themes to appeal to voters with different priorities. Her analysis of local media dynamics was sophisticated without being condescending, and her strategic recommendations consistently demonstrated both short-term, tactical thinking and long-term vision. During those early months, I'd found myself genuinely enjoying our interactions. Vanessa had a gift for making everyone feel like the most interesting person in the room, and her questions about my landscape architecture work had seemed motivated by genuine curiosity rather than mere politeness. She'd asked detailed questions about how I approached design challenges, what inspired my plant selections, and how I managed the business aspects of creative work. When I'd mentioned struggling with a particularly difficult client who wanted dramatic visual impact with minimal maintenance requirements, Vanessa had offered insights about consumer psychology that had actually helped me reframe my approach to the project. She'd also shown what appeared to be sincere interest in Daniel's situation and our family's journey through his incarceration and eventual release. During one particularly long strategy session that had extended into dinner, she'd listened thoughtfully as I explained the challenges of maintaining family unity during a crisis that had tested everyone's values and relationships. Her responses had been measured and empathetic, acknowledging the complexity of loving someone who'd made a devastating mistake while grieving for the innocent life that had been lost. "It takes real strength to support family while still holding them accountable," she'd said that evening, her voice carrying what seemed like genuine admiration. "Jonathan is lucky to have a wife who understands that loyalty and justice aren't mutually exclusive." At the time, I'd been touched by her understanding and impressed by her ability to grasp the nuanced emotional terrain that had defined our lives for the past 5 years. Vanessa's integration into our social circle had been gradual but thorough. She'd attended barbecues at our home, joined us for weekend wine tastings at local vineyards, and even volunteered to help with the annual fundraiser for the Willowmere Springs Community Garden that I'd organized for the past 3 years. Her presence at these events had never felt intrusive or calculating. Instead, she'd seemed to enhance every gathering with her wit, her thoughtful questions, and her ability to connect with people across different age groups and backgrounds. Jonathan's colleagues and their wives had embraced her almost immediately. Patricia Morrison, whose husband served on the city council, had praised Vanessa's insights about regional economic development during a dinner party at the country club. "She really understands how to balance growth with preservation," Patricia had told me over coffee the following week. "Jonathan is smart to have someone like that on his team." Even my more skeptical friends, like Sarah Chen, who owned the town's most successful real estate agency, had admitted that Vanessa brought a level of sophistication to Jonathan's campaign that elevated his entire political operation. The professional relationship between Jonathan and Vanessa had appeared to exemplify everything positive about modern political consulting. She challenged his assumptions without undermining his confidence, pushed him to articulate his vision more clearly without changing his fundamental message, and helped him navigate the inevitable conflicts that arose during any competitive campaign. Their working sessions in our home office had seemed productive and energizing, with both of them emerging from long planning meetings with the kind of focused enthusiasm that suggested genuine collaboration and mutual respect. Vanessa had also proven adept at managing the delicate balance required when addressing Daniel's history during campaign events. She'd developed messaging strategies that acknowledged the family's experience with the criminal justice system without either exploiting the tragedy or appearing to minimize its seriousness. Her approach had allowed Jonathan to speak authentically about the importance of both accountability and redemption, themes that resonated strongly with Willowmere Springs voters who valued both law and order and Christian forgiveness. The framework she'd created had transformed what could have been a political liability into one of Jonathan's strongest assets. Voters respected a candidate who'd stood by his family during difficult times while maintaining his commitment to justice and community safety. The narrative had been so skillfully crafted that Jonathan's association with Daniel's case had actually enhanced his reputation rather than damaging it, demonstrating his character and judgment in ways that purely professional accomplishments couldn't match. During campaign events, I'd watched Vanessa work crowds with the skill of someone who genuinely enjoyed human connection. She remembered names, asked follow-up questions about conversations from previous events, and had an uncanny ability to identify the specific concerns that motivated individual voters. Whether she was discussing downtown revitalization with local business owners or talking about school funding with young parents, she demonstrated both authentic interest and substantive knowledge that impressed everyone she encountered. Her relationship with me had seemed to evolve naturally from professional courtesy to genuine friendship. We'd begun having lunch together weekly, ostensibly to coordinate campaign-related social events, but increasingly just to enjoy each other's company. Vanessa had shared stories about her own career challenges, her thoughts about balancing professional ambition with personal relationships, and her observations about the unique culture of small southern towns. She'd seemed particularly interested in my perspective on maintaining individual identity within a political marriage, asking thoughtful questions about how I navigated the expectations that came with being a candidate's wife. Looking back now, I realized that every conversation, every shared confidence, every moment of apparent intimacy had been part of a larger strategy that I'd been too trusting to recognize. Vanessa hadn't been building a friendship. She'd been conducting reconnaissance, gathering intelligence about our marriage, our vulnerabilities, and our family dynamics that she could use to position herself more effectively within our lives. The woman who'd seemed so genuinely interested in my work, so supportive of our family's journey, so committed to Jonathan's political success, had been systematically infiltrating every aspect of our existence with the patience and precision of someone who understood exactly what she wanted and how to get it. The first crack in Vanessa's perfect facade appeared during a casual conversation about wine preferences at the Pembertons' anniversary party 6 weeks ago. She'd been describing a supposedly memorable evening at a vineyard in Napa Valley, painting vivid details about the sunset over the mountains and the particular notes of a Cabernet Sauvignon that had paired beautifully with the salmon she'd ordered. But when Patricia Morrison mentioned that she'd honeymooned in that exact region and asked about the specific vineyard, Vanessa's description shifted subtly, becoming vague about details that should have been memorable and offering conflicting information about the location's layout and signature wines. It was the kind of inconsistency that most people would dismiss as faulty memory or nervous conversation. But my years of working with clients had taught me to pay attention when stories didn't align properly. In landscape architecture, details matter enormously, and I'd developed an instinct for recognizing when someone was embellishing or fabricating experiences to seem more sophisticated or well-traveled than they actually were. Vanessa's wine story had triggered that same mental alert, though I'd pushed the feeling aside and attributed it to my own overthinking. The second red flag had emerged during a strategy session 3 weeks later when Vanessa was explaining her research into voter demographics in neighboring counties. She'd referenced specific polling data from a congressional race 2 years prior, citing numbers and trends with the confidence of someone who'd been intimately involved in that campaign. But when Jonathan mentioned that he'd actually consulted on that same race and remembered the polling data quite differently, Vanessa had quickly backtracked, claiming she'd confused the numbers with a different campaign from the same time period. Again, it was the type of mistake that could easily be explained by the complex nature of political consulting work, where professionals often juggled multiple campaigns simultaneously, and specific details could blur together over time. But combined with the wine conversation, it created a pattern that nagged at my subconscious, even as I consciously dismissed my concerns as petty suspicion. The third incident had been more difficult to rationalize away. During a fundraising event at the country club, Vanessa had been discussing her undergraduate experience at Duke with several guests who were alumni from the same era. When the conversation turned to specific professors and campus traditions, her responses had been oddly generic, lacking the kind of specific memories and shared references that typically emerge when people discover they'd attended the same institution during overlapping periods. More troubling had been her reaction when someone mentioned Professor Elizabeth Hartley, who'd apparently been a legendary figure in the communications department during the years when Vanessa would have been completing her degree. Instead of the immediate recognition that should have accompanied mention of such a prominent faculty member, Vanessa had looked momentarily blank before offering a vague comment about having taken so many classes that individual professors sometimes blurred together. The excuse had been plausible enough to prevent awkward questions, but I'd noticed that she'd quickly steered the conversation toward more recent professional experiences rather than continuing to discuss her college years. For someone who'd otherwise seemed comfortable sharing personal anecdotes and professional history, the sudden reticence about her undergraduate experience had felt jarring and inconsistent. But it was the changes in Jonathan's behavior that had really begun to alarm me. Subtle shifts that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively suggested something fundamental had altered in our relationship dynamics. He'd always been attentive to my work and interested in my projects, but over the past few months, his questions about my business had become perfunctory, almost obligatory. When I'd landed a major contract to redesign the gardens at Willowmere Regional Medical Center, his congratulations had felt hollow, lacking the genuine enthusiasm that had characterized his response to my professional achievements throughout our marriage. His schedule had also become increasingly unpredictable, with evening campaign meetings that seemed to run much later than necessary, and weekend strategy sessions that apparently required privacy and couldn't accommodate my presence even in a supportive capacity. When I'd offered to prepare dinner for one of these extended planning sessions, Jonathan had quickly declined, explaining that Vanessa preferred to work without distractions and that my presence, however welcome, might disrupt their concentration. The explanation had been reasonable, even considerate, but it represented a departure from our established pattern of including me in campaign-related activities whenever possible. Throughout the early months of his political preparation, Jonathan had actively sought my input on everything from event planning to messaging strategies, valuing my perspective as both a wife and a successful businesswoman who understood the local community. The sudden exclusion from important discussions had felt like a subtle but significant diminishment of my role in his political life. Even more concerning had been Jonathan's increasing criticism of small aspects of our domestic life. Comments that seemed designed to create distance rather than address legitimate concerns. He'd begun making offhand remarks about my cooking, suggesting that my meal planning had become predictable and that we should explore more sophisticated dining options. When I'd proposed hosting a dinner party for major campaign donors, he'd suggested that Vanessa might be better positioned to handle the planning, given her professional experience with high-stakes entertaining. These comments had been delivered without malice, framed as practical suggestions rather than personal criticisms, but they'd represented a fundamental shift in how Jonathan viewed my contributions to our shared life. The woman who'd successfully managed dozens of elaborate social events throughout our marriage was suddenly being portrayed as inadequate for the demands of political entertaining, despite having demonstrated those exact skills countless times over the previous 8 years. Most unsettling had been Jonathan's new habit of taking phone calls in his car rather than in his home office, claiming that he needed to discuss sensitive political strategies that required absolute privacy. When I'd pointed out that his home office was already equipped with soundproofing and secure communication systems, he'd explained that Vanessa had recommended additional precautions given the competitive nature of local politics and the possibility that rivals might attempt to gather intelligence about his campaign strategies. The paranoia had seemed excessive for a mayoral race in a town of 12,000 people, but Jonathan had been adamant that successful politicians needed to assume their communications were being monitored and their strategies were being analyzed by opposition researchers. His new commitment to operational security had meant that I was increasingly excluded from conversations about his campaign, despite having been intimately involved in the planning and strategy development during the initial months of his political preparation. The cumulative effect of these changes had been a gradual erosion of the partnership that had defined our marriage, replaced by a dynamic where I felt like a peripheral figure in Jonathan's increasingly important political life. The man who'd once sought my advice on major decisions was now presenting me with conclusions that had apparently been reached through discussions I wasn't permitted to witness, involving strategies I wasn't qualified to understand. What I hadn't realized at the time was that Jonathan's growing distance from me corresponded directly with his increasing closeness to Vanessa, and that the professional boundaries he'd established around their working relationship were actually providing cover for an intimacy that had nothing to do with political consulting and everything to do with a betrayal that was reshaping every aspect of our marriage without my knowledge or consent. The moment that shattered my willful ignorance came on a Tuesday morning when I was least prepared for life-altering revelations. I'd been battling a particularly stubborn case of bronchitis for 3 days, the kind of illness that left me feeling foggy and disconnected, but not quite sick enough to justify complete bed rest. Jonathan had left early for what he described as a breakfast meeting with potential campaign donors in Charlotte, and I'd planned to spend the morning catching up on administrative work from my home office while nursing hot tea and honey. Around 10:30, I realized I'd left my project, files for the Morrison estate redesign, in Jonathan's car from the previous evening when we'd returned from a campaign event together. The drawings contained detailed measurements and plant specifications that I needed to finalize my presentation for Thursday's client meeting, and I couldn't afford to wait until Jonathan returned that evening to retrieve them. Using my spare key, I went to his BMW to collect the folder from the passenger seat where I'd placed it the night before. The files were exactly where I'd left them, but as I gathered the documents, my elbow accidentally hit the button that opened the center console compartment. Inside, nestled among breath mints and charging cables, was Jonathan's spare phone, a device I'd never seen before and had no idea he possessed. The phone was an older model iPhone with a cracked screen protector, clearly not his primary device, and it was currently displaying several unread text message notifications. My first instinct was to close the console and forget what I'd seen, respecting the privacy boundaries that had been fundamental to our marriage. But the phone buzzed with another incoming message as I hesitated, and the preview notification was visible enough that I could see it began with, "Good morning, darling," in a text thread labeled simply V. The rational part of my mind offered innocent explanations even as my hands trembled while picking up the device. Perhaps it was an old phone he'd kept for backup purposes, or maybe it was related to campaign security measures that Vanessa had recommended. The messages might be routine political communications that used affectionate language as some kind of code for sensitive information. But when I opened the text thread, the messages that appeared on the screen destroyed every rational explanation and replaced them with a reality so devastating that I had to grip the car door to remain standing. The conversation history revealed months of intimate exchanges between my husband and Vanessa Hartwell, messages that documented not just a physical affair, but an emotional relationship that had apparently become the center of both their lives. I can't stop thinking about yesterday afternoon, read one message from Vanessa, sent just 2 days prior. The way you looked at me when we were discussing the budget proposals made it impossible to concentrate on anything else. I keep replaying that moment when you touched my hand and wondering how much longer we have to pretend this is just professional. Jonathan's response had been equally revealing. Being in the same room with you while maintaining professional distance is torture. Every campaign event where I have to watch you charm other people while knowing I can't publicly claim you is getting harder to endure. 3 more months until the election, and then we can finally stop hiding. The thread contained hundreds of similar messages spanning back nearly 5 months, documenting the evolution of their relationship from what appeared to be initial attraction through the development of a full-blown affair that included detailed planning for a future together. They'd discussed specific hotels where they'd met, restaurants where they'd shared intimate dinners during supposed campaign strategy sessions, and even vacation destinations they planned to visit together after Jonathan's election victory. More devastating than the evidence of physical infidelity were the emotional intimacies revealed in their exchanges. Vanessa had shared details about her childhood, her career ambitions, and her thoughts about marriage and family that indicated a level of vulnerability and trust that I'd believed was reserved for my relationship with Jonathan. Meanwhile, Jonathan had confided frustrations about our marriage, complaints about my lack of political sophistication, and criticisms of my personality traits that he'd never expressed directly to me. Sometimes I feel like Sophia sees me as a project to be managed, rather than a man to be admired, he'd written in one particularly cruel message. She's so focused on controlling every detail of our domestic life that she's lost sight of what attracted me to her in the first place. With you, I feel like the man I'm supposed to be instead of the husband I'm expected to be. Vanessa's response had been equally devastating. You deserve someone who appreciates your ambition instead of trying to contain it. Sophia's need to micromanage everything probably worked when you were building your consulting business, but political leadership requires a different kind of partner, someone who can enhance your public image instead of limiting it. As I scrolled through months of messages, a more sinister pattern began to emerge beyond the typical selfishness of an extramarital affair. Vanessa had been systematically gathering information about our personal finances, our family relationships, and even details about Daniel's parole conditions and rehabilitation progress. She'd asked seemingly innocent questions about my business clients, our property investments, and Jonathan's long-term political ambitions that had apparently been designed to assess the complete scope of what she would gain by replacing me in his life. Most chilling were the messages where she discussed strategies for undermining my relationship with Jonathan's political allies and gradually positioning herself as a more suitable partner for his career advancement. She'd identified specific weaknesses in my public speaking abilities, analyzed my fashion choices at campaign events, and even critiqued my social media presence as too focused on professional achievements and not supportive enough of Jonathan's political brand. But it was the final exchange in the message thread that transformed my shock and hurt into something much more dangerous. Cold, calculating fury. The conversation had taken place just 3 days ago, apparently after the fundraising event where I'd noticed Vanessa's evasiveness about her college experience. I think Sophia is starting to suspect something, Vanessa had written. She was asking Patricia Morrison some very specific questions about my background at Duke, and she's been watching our interactions more carefully during public events. We might need to accelerate our timeline. Jonathan's response had been immediate. How much does she know? Can we contain this until after the election? I don't think she knows about us specifically, but she's definitely noticed inconsistencies in my biographical details. The problem is that Sophia has those obsessive attention-to-detail tendencies that make her dangerous when she starts investigating something. We need to be more careful about maintaining distance in public, and I think I should stop attending events at your house for a while. That might actually make things worse. If you suddenly become less available, she'll definitely know something is wrong. Maybe we should consider telling her after the election. By then, my political position will be secure enough that a divorce won't destroy everything we've worked for. Jonathan, we can't wait that long. I've been researching the divorce laws in North Carolina, and if she files before you're elected, she could potentially claim a significant portion of your future political earnings and pension benefits. But if we wait until you're in office and then initiate the divorce ourselves, we can control the narrative and minimize the financial damage. The cold calculation in their discussion of destroying my life while protecting their own interests was breathtaking in its selfishness. They weren't just conducting an affair, they were planning the systematic dismantling of my marriage, my financial security, and my place in the community we'd built together, all while ensuring that their betrayal would cause me maximum damage and provide them with maximum benefit. As I sat in Jonathan's car reading the evidence of their conspiracy, I realized that my marriage hadn't just been betrayed. It had been strategically targeted for destruction by two people who'd been planning my emotional and financial ruin for months, while accepting my hospitality, my support, and my trust. D. Woman who'd sat at my dinner table offering advice about political campaigns had been simultaneously plotting to replace me in my husband's life and steal everything I'd worked to build. But what she didn't know, what neither of them could have anticipated, was that her past was about to collide with her present in ways that would destroy not just their affair, but everything they'd both worked to achieve. After photographing every message on Jonathan's secret phone and carefully returning it to exactly the position where I'd found it, I spent the rest of that Tuesday in a state of controlled fury that surprised me with its clarity. The shock and devastation I'd expected to feel were present, but they were overshadowed by something far more useful: the methodical, problem-solving mindset that had made me successful in my career. Vanessa and Jonathan had underestimated me completely, viewing me as an obstacle to be managed rather than an opponent to be respected. That miscalculation was about to become their downfall. My first priority was understanding exactly who Vanessa Hartwell really was, beyond the carefully constructed professional persona she'd presented to our community. The inconsistencies I'd noticed in her stories about Duke University and her previous campaign experience now took on sinister significance, suggesting that significant portions of her background might be fabricated. Using the advanced search techniques I'd learned for researching potential business clients, I began systematically investigating every aspect of her claimed history. The Duke University Alumni Directory yielded no record of any Vanessa Hartwell graduating with a communications degree during the years she'd specified, nor during the 2 years before or after that time frame. When I expanded the search to include other possible degree programs and name variations, the results remained empty. Either she'd attended under a different name or her entire educational background was fictional. Cross-referencing with the Charlotte-based consulting firm she'd claimed as previous employment revealed that while the company did exist and had an impressive client roster, their employee directory and project histories contained no mention of anyone matching Vanessa's description or claimed experience. This revelation led me to dig deeper into her professional credentials, using database searches and public records to trace her actual career path. What I discovered was both fascinating and terrifying in its implications. The real Vanessa Hartwell had indeed worked in political consulting, but her actual resume was far different from what she'd presented to us. She'd spent 3 years as a junior researcher for a small firm in Raleigh that specialized in opposition research, the practice of gathering damaging information about political candidates for use by their rivals. Her expertise wasn't in strategic communications or campaign management. It was in finding and exploiting weaknesses in public figures' personal lives, financial histories, and family relationships. She was essentially a professional investigator whose job involved uncovering secrets that could be used to destroy political careers. The skills she'd developed in that role, the ability to research targets thoroughly, identify vulnerabilities, and maintain false personas while gathering intelligence, had apparently been repurposed for more personal forms of destruction. But the most chilling discovery came when I cross-referenced her employment history with the timeline of Daniel's trial 5 years ago. During the months when she'd been testifying as a key witness in his vehicular manslaughter case, Vanessa had been working for Morrison Research Associates, the same opposition research firm. Her presence in downtown Asheville on the night of Mice. The accident hadn't been coincidental. She'd been conducting surveillance on Daniel as part of a background investigation commissioned by unknown clients who had apparently wanted information about our family. The implications were staggering. Vanessa's testimony about witnessing Daniel's accident hadn't been the honest account of a concerned citizen. It had been the deliberate statement of someone who'd been professionally monitoring his activities. Her detailed description of his driving behavior, her certainty about his speed and apparent intoxication, and her confident presentation during cross-examination suddenly made sense in a completely different context. She'd been prepared for that testimony because surveillance of Daniel had been her job, not her chance encounter. This revelation forced me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about Daniel's case and our family's subsequent experiences. If Vanessa had been conducting professional surveillance on Daniel, who had commissioned that investigation? Why had our family been targeted for opposition research months before Daniel's accident? And most importantly, how much had Vanessa known about the factors that led to that tragic collision? I spent the next several hours researching Morrison Research Associates more thoroughly, using professional networking sites and industry publications to understand their typical client base and operational methods. What I learned painted a disturbing picture of an organization that specialized in long-term intelligence gathering for clients who wanted comprehensive information about potential threats, business rivals, or political enemies. Their services weren't limited to simple background checks. They conducted sophisticated operations that could span months or years, building detailed profiles of targets' relationships, financial vulnerabilities, and behavioral patterns. The timing of Vanessa's surveillance on Daniel suggested that someone had identified our family as worthy of investigation well before the accident that changed everything. But my research hadn't yet revealed who might have commissioned such an operation, or why we would have been considered targets worthy of such extensive professional attention. That answer would require accessing information that was beyond my ability to gather through public records and internet searches. However, my investigation had already revealed enough to fundamentally change my understanding of our current situation. Vanessa's infiltration of our lives wasn't opportunistic. It was the continuation of a professional operation that had been targeting our family for years. Her affair with Jonathan wasn't a romantic betrayal that had evolved naturally from professional collaboration. It was a strategic manipulation designed to achieve objectives that went far beyond personal satisfaction or even political advancement. The woman who'd positioned herself as Jonathan's campaign consultant and potential future partner was actually a professional operative whose specialty was destroying the lives of people like us. Her apparent expertise in political strategy was real, but it had been developed through years of identifying how to damage political figures rather than help them succeed. She'd been using those same skills to systematically dismantle our marriage, while positioning herself to benefit from Jonathan's political success. But perhaps most importantly, my investigation had revealed that Vanessa's presence in our lives was connected to events that preceded her supposed relationship with Jonathan by years. The surveillance that had contributed to Daniel's conviction, the professional targeting of our family, and now the systematic destruction of my marriage were all part of a larger pattern that I was only beginning to understand. What I needed now was help from someone with the professional skills and legal authority to uncover the full scope of what had been done to our family and who was ultimately responsible for orchestrating years of systematic destruction. The evidence I'd gathered was substantial enough to demonstrate that crimes had been committed. but it was also complex enough that I couldn't pursue justice alone. That evening, while Jonathan was supposedly attending another late campaign meeting, that I now knew was actually a romantic dinner with his manipulative mistress, I made the phone call that would transform my investigation from personal discovery into professional pursuit of justice. Daniel's former defense attorney, Marcus Webb, had maintained contact with our family throughout the years since the trial, and he'd always expressed lingering concerns about certain aspects of the prosecution's case that had never been fully explained. When I told Marcus what I'd discovered about Vanessa's true professional background and her connection to the opposition research firm, his response was immediate and emphatic. "Sophia, if what you're telling me is accurate, then Daniel's conviction may have been based on perjured testimony from a professional operative. We need to involve law enforcement immediately, and we need to document everything you've found before anyone realizes you know the truth." The investigation that had begun with my accidental discovery of a secret phone was about to become something much larger and more dangerous than a simple case of marital infidelity. Vanessa Hartwell had made the mistake of targeting a family that refused to be destroyed quietly, and her past was finally about to catch up with her present in ways that would expose not just her current crimes, but potentially years of professional misconduct that had ruined innocent lives. Marcus Webb arrived at my house within 2 hours of my phone call, bringing with him a digital forensics expert named Claire Rodriguez and a grim expression that told me he'd already begun to grasp the full implications of what I'd discovered. As we sat in my kitchen reviewing the evidence I'd gathered, Marcus explained that he'd harbored suspicions about certain aspects of Daniel's case for years, but had never possessed the resources or legal standing to investigate his concerns thoroughly. Vanessa Hartwell's testimony was unusually detailed for someone who claimed to be a casual observer, Marcus explained as Claire began analyzing the photographs I'd taken of Jonathan's phone messages. Most eyewitnesses struggled to recall specific details about vehicle speed or driver behavior, especially during traumatic events. But Vanessa provided precise estimates and confident assertions that seemed inconsistent with normal witness psychology. At the time, I attributed it to some people being naturally more observant, but now it's clear she was prepared for that testimony, because observation was her profession. Claire's preliminary analysis of the text messages revealed additional evidence that strengthened our case beyond simple adultery. The metadata embedded in the photos Vanessa and Jonathan had exchanged showed that many of their supposed private meetings had taken place during times when Jonathan had publicly claimed to be attending official campaign events or conducting legitimate business. This created a documented pattern of fraud that extended beyond personal relationships into potential campaign finance violations and abuse of public trust. More significantly, Claire had identified several messages where Vanessa referenced completing the operation and achieving the original objectives, language that suggested her affair with Jonathan was part of a larger, coordinated effort rather than spontaneous romantic attraction. When combined with her professional background in opposition research and her false testimony during Daniel's trial, these messages indicated a sophisticated long-term campaign to systematically destroy our family's stability and reputation. But pursuing legal remedies through traditional channels would have been complicated by several factors that made immediate confrontation inadvisable. Jonathan's position as a mayoral candidate provided him with significant community influence and political connections that could potentially interfere with law enforcement investigations. Vanessa's expertise in manipulation and deception meant she would likely be able to construct convincing alternative explanations for any evidence we presented, particularly if she had time to prepare her defense and coordinate with Jonathan. Most importantly, we still didn't know who had originally commissioned Vanessa's surveillance of Daniel, or why our family had been targeted for such extensive professional attention. Alerting Vanessa to our knowledge before identifying her ultimate clients would allow unknown conspirators to escape accountability and potentially destroy evidence of their involvement in Daniel's wrongful conviction. Marcus proposed a strategy that would serve multiple objectives simultaneously: exposing Vanessa's current crimes, gathering evidence about her past misconduct, and identifying the parties responsible for orchestrating years of attacks on our family. The plan required careful coordination and precise timing, but it offered the possibility of achieving complete justice rather than merely addressing the immediate betrayal. The centerpiece of our strategy would be a controlled confrontation that would force Vanessa to reveal information about her background and motivations while providing us with recorded evidence of her admissions. Rather than simply presenting her with what we'd discovered and allowing her to construct defensive responses, we would create a scenario where her professional instincts would compel her to reveal additional details about her operations and connections. The key was understanding that Vanessa's greatest strength, her ability to manipulate people through careful psychological assessment and strategic relationship building, could also become her greatest vulnerability if we could create circumstances where her professional pride overrode her personal caution. Marcus had observed this phenomenon during his years of criminal defense work. Sophisticated operators often couldn't resist demonstrating their expertise, even when doing so compromised their legal position. Our plan would leverage Daniel's upcoming visit to create maximum psychological pressure on Vanessa, while providing us with multiple opportunities to gather evidence and force revelations. The garden party Jonathan had mentioned would serve as the perfect venue, allowing us to control the environment, document everything that occurred, and ensure that multiple witnesses were present to verify what transpired. But the confrontation itself would only be the culmination of a more complex operation designed to gather comprehensive evidence and build an unassailable case. Over the next several days, Claire would install sophisticated surveillance equipment throughout our property that would capture both audio and video evidence of any interactions between Jonathan and Vanessa. Meanwhile, Marcus would file sealed court documents requesting Daniel's case be reviewed for potential prosecutorial misconduct, creating a legal framework for investigating Vanessa's past testimony without alerting her to our current knowledge. Most crucially, we would use the time between now and Daniel's arrival to conduct additional research into Morrison Research Associates and their client relationships during the period when Vanessa had been surveilling our family. Marcus had contacts within the private investigation industry who might be able to provide insights into who had commissioned such extensive background research on a construction supervisor and his family. The timeline we established required meticulous coordination, but offered the possibility of exposing a conspiracy that had been operating against our family for years. Daniel would arrive on Saturday afternoon, exactly as planned, but he would be fully briefed about Vanessa's true identity and role in his conviction before encountering her at the party. This preparation would allow him to maintain composure during their initial interaction while providing emotional impact that would demonstrate to witnesses the human cost of Vanessa's professional activities. Jonathan, meanwhile, would remain completely unaware of our knowledge until the moment of confrontation. His continued belief that his affair was secret would ensure that he maintained normal behavior patterns and continued sharing information with Vanessa that could potentially incriminate both of them further. We would monitor their communications throughout the week, gathering additional evidence while allowing them to feel secure in their deception. The garden party itself would be carefully choreographed to maximize the effectiveness of our revelations while ensuring that everything we did remained within legal boundaries. We would invite witnesses whose presence would guarantee that news of what transpired would spread throughout the community, effectively ending both Jonathan's political career and Vanessa's ability to continue operating under false pretenses. But more importantly, the public nature of the confrontation would provide protection against any attempts at retaliation or evidence destruction. Claire had already begun installing the necessary recording equipment throughout our property, using devices so sophisticated that they were undetectable even to someone with Vanessa's professional training. By Saturday afternoon, every conversation, every admission, and every attempt at manipulation would be captured in high-definition detail that could be used in both criminal proceedings and civil litigation. Marcus had also initiated contact with federal authorities who specialized in investigating corruption within state and local political systems. The evidence of Vanessa's past perjury, combined with the ongoing fraud involving Jonathan's campaign, suggested violations of federal laws that would ensure serious consequences regardless of any local political influence that might otherwise protect them. But perhaps most satisfying was the realization that Vanessa's expertise in psychological manipulation had led her to construct a scenario that would ultimately ensure her own downfall. Her decision to target our family, her confidence in her ability to control Jonathan's emotions and political ambitions, and her apparent belief that she could systematically destroy my life without consequences, had positioned her perfectly for the kind of complete exposure that would end not just her current operations, but her entire professional career. The woman who had spent years perfecting the art of destroying other people's lives was about to discover that some targets possessed the intelligence, resources, and determination to fight back with the same level of strategic thinking she'd used against them. The hunt that had begun with her surveillance of Daniel was about to reach its conclusion, but this time, she would be the prey rather than the predator. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of perfect weather that seemed designed for outdoor entertaining, the late October air crisp enough to be invigorating, but warm enough that guests could comfortably move between the house and garden throughout the afternoon. As I arranged the final details for what Jonathan believed was a routine campaign fundraiser, every element of the day felt charged with significance that only I fully understood. The white tent I'd rented stood elegantly on the back lawn. The catering tables were positioned to encourage natural circulation among guests, and the sound system that would soon broadcast Vanessa's admissions to 50 of Willowmere Springs. Most influential residence was hidden discreetly among the autumn floral arrangements. Claire had completed the installation of recording equipment throughout the property the night before, working with military precision to ensure that every conversation would be captured in crystal-clear detail. Tiny wireless microphones were embedded in strategic locations around the garden. Sophisticated cameras were positioned to provide multiple angles of the confrontation area, and backup recording devices guaranteed that technical failures couldn't compromise our evidence gathering. The system was so advanced that it could isolate individual voices even during crowded conversations, ensuring that Vanessa's words would be preserved regardless of background noise or competing discussions. Jonathan had spent Friday evening reviewing his speech notes and strategizing about which donors to prioritize for deeper conversations, completely unaware that his political career was scheduled to end approximately 4 hours after the first guests arrived. His excitement about the event was genuine and touching in its naivety. He truly believed this fundraiser would mark a significant milestone in his journey toward electoral victory. When he'd kissed me goodbye that morning before leaving for what he claimed was a final strategy session with Vanessa, his confidence had been so complete that I'd almost felt sorry for him. The guest list I'd carefully curated included several key figures whose presence would ensure maximum impact when the truth emerged. Patricia Morrison would guarantee that news of the revelations spread throughout the local Republican women's organization within hours. Judge Harrison Caldwell's attendance would provide legal gravitas to any criminal allegations that emerged. Rebecca Torres, Jonathan's campaign manager, would serve as a witness to the professional misconduct that had corrupted the entire political operation. Most importantly, Daniel's parole officer, Sandra Kim, would be present to verify his character and rehabilitation progress when Vanessa's role in his wrongful conviction was exposed. But the most crucial element of the day's choreography involved Daniel himself, who had driven down from Asheville early that morning for a private briefing that had fundamentally altered his understanding of his own history. When Marcus and I had explained Vanessa's true identity and her professional surveillance activities during the period before his accident, Daniel's reaction had been a mixture of rage, vindication, and profound sadness that his family had endured. Years of suffering based on deliberately fabricated testimony. "I always knew something felt wrong about her testimony," Daniel had said quietly as we reviewed the evidence in my kitchen. The details she provided were too specific, too confident for someone who'd supposedly just glanced out a window. But my attorney at the time said that questioning her credibility without concrete evidence would make me look like I was refusing to accept responsibility for Mrs. Chen's death. The conversation with Daniel had been emotionally devastating but strategically necessary. He needed to understand not only what Vanessa had done to him, but also how her continued presence in our lives represented an ongoing threat to our entire family. The woman who had helped send him to prison was now positioned to destroy Jonathan's career and my financial security, all while maintaining the facade of being our trusted friend and advisor. More importantly, Daniel needed to be prepared for the psychological impact of encountering Vanessa face-to-face for the first time since his trial. We'd discussed various scenarios for how she might react when she realized he was present, from attempting to flee the party to trying to maintain her cover through aggressive denial of any connection to his case. Marcus had coached him on how to remain composed regardless of her response, emphasizing that any loss of control on his part could be used to discredit our allegations or shift focus away from her misconduct. The timing of Daniel's arrival had been planned with mathematical precision. The party would begin at 2 o'clock, with early guests consisting primarily of casual supporters and community leaders who would create a comfortable social atmosphere. Vanessa and Jonathan would arrive together around 2:30, allowing them to make their entrance as the confident political power couple they believed themselves to be. The core fundraising activities would take place between 3 and 4 o'clock, during which time I would systematically gather additional evidence through carefully guided conversations. Daniel would make his appearance at exactly 4:15, entering through the garden gate with the casual confidence of a family member arriving fashionably late to a social gathering. The timing would ensure that most guests were present and engaged in conversation, creating maximum witness potential while preventing Vanessa from having time to process his presence and construct defensive strategies. But perhaps the most delicate aspect of the day's execution involved maintaining my own performance as the devoted political wife who remained completely unaware of her husband's betrayal. For the past week, I'd perfected the art of behaving normally while possessing devastating knowledge, smiling at Vanessa during planning meetings while knowing she was systematically destroying my life, and discussing campaign strategies with Jonathan while understanding that his political ambitions were about to be obliterated by his own choices. The emotional discipline required for this extended deception had been exhausting, but it was absolutely crucial for the success of our operation. Any indication that I knew about the affair or suspected Vanessa's true background would have prompted defensive measures that could compromise our evidence gathering. Their confidence in their own cleverness was the foundation upon which their downfall would be constructed. As I put the finishing touches on the table arrangements and checked the positioning of the recording equipment one final time, I felt a strange sense of peace settling over me. For weeks, I'd been the victim of a sophisticated conspiracy designed to destroy everything I'd worked to build. Today, I would become the architect of justice for not only my own family, but potentially for other victims of Vanessa's professional misconduct who had never possessed the resources or determination to fight back. The irony was perfect. Vanessa's expertise in psychological manipulation and strategic deception would be turned against her by someone she'd consistently underestimated. The woman who had spent years perfecting the art of destroying other people's lives was about to discover that some targets possess the intelligence and determination to transform victimhood into victory. Jonathan's BMW pulled into our driveway at exactly 2:28, with Vanessa emerging from the passenger seat in a stunning burgundy dress that perfectly complemented the autumn setting. As I watched her approach the garden with that familiar, confident smile, I knew that in less than 2 hours, that expression would be replaced by the kind of terror that comes from realizing that all your careful plans have been anticipated and countered by someone far more dangerous than you ever imagined. The first 2 hours of the party unfolded exactly as planned, with guests mingling naturally throughout the garden, while Vanessa and Jonathan worked the crowd with practiced political charm. I watched from my position near the beverage station as Vanessa demonstrated her expertise in social manipulation, moving effortlessly between conversations with donors, remembering personal details about their businesses and families, and subtly reinforcing Jonathan's qualifications for mayor through carefully planted comments and strategic questions. Her performance was flawless, the result of months of preparation and years of professional training in reading people and exploiting their psychological vulnerabilities. She complimented Patricia Morrison's recent interior design choices while seamlessly transitioning into discussion about Jonathan's vision for downtown revitalization. She engaged Judge Caldwell in conversation about legal reforms while positioning Jonathan as someone who understood the delicate balance between public safety and individual rights. Every interaction served dual purposes, advancing Jonathan's political interest while gathering intelligence about potential allies and opponents. But at exactly 4:12, as Vanessa was explaining Jonathan's economic development strategies to a group of local business owners, I saw her attention shift toward the garden gate. Her confident expression flickered almost imperceptibly, replaced by what looked like confusion as she processed the sight of a tall, familiar figure approaching through the crowd of guests. Daniel walked through the gate with the relaxed confidence we'd rehearsed, wearing a navy sport coat and khaki pants that made him look like any other young professional attending a political fundraiser. His 5 years in prison had changed him physically. He was leaner, more serious around the eyes, but his fundamental bearing remained the same. To most guests, he appeared to be simply another family member arriving fashionably late to support Jonathan's campaign. But Vanessa's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The color drained from her face as she recognized the man whose life she'd helped destroy, and her wine glass trembled slightly in her hand as the full implications of his presence began to register. She glanced quickly around the crowd, as if calculating escape routes or assessing whether anyone else had noticed her distress. Jonathan, who was engaged in conversation with Rebecca Torres about polling data, remained completely oblivious to the drama unfolding just 20 feet away. His back was turned to the gate, and his attention was focused entirely on demonstrating his command of electoral demographics to his campaign manager. I moved quickly toward Daniel, playing my role as the welcoming sister while positioning myself to ensure that our conversation would be captured clearly by the recording equipment. "Daniel!" I called out warmly, embracing him with genuine affection that required no performance. "I'm so glad you could make it. There are some people here I'd love you to meet." The sound of his name caused Jonathan to turn around, his face lighting up with what appeared to be genuine pleasure at seeing his brother-in-law. "Daniel! Perfect timing, man. Come over here and meet some folks." But as Jonathan began moving toward us, his expression shifted to confusion as he noticed Vanessa's frozen posture and pale complexion. "Vanessa? You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost?" The irony in his words was so perfect that I had to suppress a smile. In many ways, Daniel was exactly that. A ghost from Vanessa's past that she'd believed was safely buried along with his credibility and freedom. "I'm fine," Vanessa managed, though her voice was noticeably strained. "Just felt a little dizzy for a moment. The heat, probably." But Daniel had spotted her now, and the carefully rehearsed moment of recognition played out exactly as we'd planned. His expression shifted from casual friendliness to sharp focus as he processed the sight of the woman whose testimony had sent him to prison. Unlike Vanessa, however, his reaction was controlled and deliberate. "Excuse me," he said politely, approaching her with the kind of measured composure that comes from years of forced self-discipline. "I don't think we've been introduced. I'm Daniel Blackwood, Sophia's brother." The simple introduction hung in the air like a challenge. Around us, conversations continued normally as other guests remained unaware of the psychological warfare playing out in their midst. But I could see several people beginning to notice the tension radiating from our small group, particularly Judge Caldwell, who possessed the kind of trained observational skills that detected conflict even when it wasn't explicitly acknowledged. Vanessa's Training in deception warred visibly with her shock at Daniel's unexpected presence. She understood that running or showing obvious distress would create exactly the kind of scene that could destroy her carefully constructed cover. But she also recognized that engaging with Daniel carried enormous risks of exposure. "Vanessa Hartwell," she replied finally, extending her hand with forced professionalism. "I'm working with Jonathan on his campaign." "How interesting," Daniel responded, accepting her handshake while maintaining steady eye contact. "Have we met before? You look familiar." The question was perfectly crafted to force Vanessa into a lose-lose scenario. Acknowledging their previous connection would require explaining the circumstances of Daniel's trial, potentially exposing her role in his conviction to dozens of witnesses. But denying any previous meeting would constitute perjury if she was ever questioned under oath about this conversation. "I don't think so," she said carefully. "I would remember." "Really? Because I have an excellent memory for faces, especially faces I've seen during particularly memorable occasions, like courtrooms." The word courtrooms hit the gathering like a small explosion. Conversations around us began to slow as people processed the implications of what they were hearing. Judge Caldwell moved closer, his professional instincts clearly activated by the suggestion of legal proceedings involving someone present at the party. Jonathan looked completely bewildered, glancing between Daniel and Vanessa as he tried to understand the undercurrents of their exchange. "What are you talking about, Daniel? What courtrooms?" This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the precise opportunity to introduce the evidence that would transform suspicion into certainty and accusations into documented fact. I moved to the sound system we'd installed for Jonathan's campaign, speech, and activated the microphone that would ensure every guest could hear what followed. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice carrying across the garden with crystal clarity. "I need your attention for a few minutes. There's something about this campaign, and about some of the people involved in it, that you need to know." The crowd turned toward me with the kind of focused attention that political gatherings rarely achieved. Jonathan's face showed growing alarm as he realized that whatever was happening was far outside the script he'd anticipated for the day. 5 years ago, I continued, my brother Daniel was convicted of vehicular manslaughter, based largely on the testimony of an eyewitness who claimed to have observed his driving behavior on the night of a tragic accident that killed an innocent woman named Margaret Chen. Daniel stepped forward slightly, his presence lending weight to my words. Around the garden, guests were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than routine political entertainment. "That eyewitness," I said, letting my gaze settle on Vanessa's terrified face, "was Vanessa Hartwell. But what she didn't tell the court, what she didn't tell Daniel's defense attorney, and what she certainly didn't tell any of us, was that her presence that night wasn't coincidental. She was conducting professional surveillance on my brother as part of an opposition research operation commissioned by parties unknown." The revelation hit the crowd like a physical force. I could see shock, confusion, and growing understanding ripple through the gathering as people processed the implications of what they were hearing. Vanessa's face had gone completely white, and her hands were visibly shaking as she realized that her carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. "But that's not all," I continued, my voice growing stronger as I delivered the evidence that would destroy not just Vanessa's credibility, but Jonathan's political future as well. For the past 8 months, while serving as my husband's campaign consultant, Vanessa has been conducting an affair with Jonathan that they believed would remain secret until after the election. Jonathan's face went ashen as he understood that his private betrayal was being exposed to 50 of the most influential people in Willowmere Springs. But before he could speak, before Vanessa could attempt to deny or explain, I activated the recording system that would broadcast their own words as the final, irrefutable evidence of their conspiracy to destroy my life while advancing their own interests. The audio recording that filled the garden was devastating in its clarity. Vanessa's own voice, captured just 3 days earlier during what she'd believed was a private conversation with Jonathan, echoed across the stunned crowd. I think Sophia is starting to suspect something. She was asking Patricia Morrison some very specific questions about my background at Duke, and she's been watching our interactions more carefully during public events. We might need to accelerate our timeline. Jonathan's response followed immediately. How much does she know? Can we contain this until after the election? The words hung in the air like poison, each syllable destroying not just his political career, but his reputation as a man of integrity and family values. But it was the next exchange that sealed their fate completely. Vanessa's calculated voice continued. We can't wait that long. I've been researching the divorce laws in North Carolina, and if she files before you're elected, she could potentially claim a significant portion of your future political earnings and pension benefits. But if we wait until you're in office and then initiate the divorce ourselves, we can control the narrative and minimize the financial damage. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Patricia Morrison's face contorted with disgust as she realized she'd been charmed by a woman who was systematically planning another woman's financial ruin. Judge Caldwell's expression had shifted into the stern judicial bearing that had intimidated countless defendants over his 20-year career. Rebecca Torres was staring at Jonathan with the kind of betrayed fury that comes from discovering your professional integrity has been compromised by your client's personal corruption. Vanessa made one final, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Those recordings are taken out of context, she said, her voice rising with panic. This is obviously some kind of setup designed to... To what? Daniel interrupted, his voice cutting through her protestations with quiet authority. To expose the truth about what you did to me 5 years ago. To reveal that your entire presence in this community has been based on lies and professional misconduct. He pulled out a folder that Marcus had prepared containing copies of the opposition research documents we'd uncovered. Ladies and gentlemen, this woman worked for Morrison Research Associates when she testified at my trial. She wasn't a casual witness who happened to observe an accident. She was conducting paid surveillance on me and my family, and her testimony was prepared testimony designed to ensure my conviction. Judge Caldwell stepped forward, his legal training taking precedence over social courtesy. Ms. Hartwell, if what's being alleged here is accurate, you may have committed perjury in a criminal proceeding that resulted in wrongful imprisonment. I strongly advise you to contact an attorney before making any further statements. But Vanessa's professional composure had finally cracked completely. Years of maintaining false identities, manipulating emotions, and orchestrating deceptions had created a psychological pressure that erupted when her carefully constructed world collapsed in public. You don't understand, she said desperately, her voice becoming shrill. I was following orders. The surveillance was legitimate. Daniel Blackwood's family was flagged as requiring investigation because of their potential connections to... She stopped abruptly, realizing that she was revealing information that could implicate her employers and expose the full scope of the conspiracy that had targeted our family. But the damage was done. Her admission that the surveillance had been legitimate and ordered confirmed that Daniel's conviction had been based on professional deception rather than honest witness testimony. Jonathan, meanwhile, had been watching his political career disintegrate in real time. The man who'd built his campaign on themes of integrity and family values had been exposed as an adulterer, who'd conspired with his mistress to financially devastate his wife while lying to the community about his character and judgment. When he finally found his voice, it was to make the situation immeasurably worse. Sophia, you have to understand, he pleaded, apparently oblivious to the 50 witnesses listening to every word. What Vanessa and I have is real. I never meant for you to find out this way, but I can't pretend anymore that our marriage is what either of us wants. The admission of the affair, delivered in front of Judge Caldwell, his campaign manager, and dozens of potential voters, was the final nail in the coffin of his political ambitions. Patricia Morrison actually gasped audibly. and I could see several guests reaching for their phones to begin spreading news of the revelations throughout the community. But the most satisfying moment came when Sandra Kim, Daniel's parole officer, approached our group with the kind of professional determination that suggested official consequences were about to follow. "Mr. Blackwood," she said to Daniel, "based on what I've heard here today, I'm going to recommend that the district attorney's office review your case for potential prosecutorial misconduct. If this woman's testimony was indeed perjured, there may be grounds for overturning your conviction entirely." The words hit Vanessa like a physical blow. Not only was her current operation exposed, but her past crimes were about to be investigated by law enforcement officials with the authority to pursue criminal charges. The woman who'd spent years destroying other people's lives was about to face the full force of the justice system she'd corrupted. As guests began leaving the party in shocked clusters, discussing what they'd witnessed in hushed, urgent tones, I felt a profound sense of completion settling over me. The investigation that had begun with my accidental discovery of Jonathan's secret phone had culminated in complete justice for my family and comprehensive consequences for those who'd wronged us. Within hours, news of the revelations had spread throughout Willowmere Springs and beyond. Jonathan's campaign headquarters received dozens of calls from supporters withdrawing their endorsements, and by Monday morning, he'd officially suspended his mayoral bid. Rebecca Torres released a statement distancing the campaign organization from both Jonathan and Vanessa, emphasizing that she'd been completely unaware of their personal relationship or Vanessa's fraudulent background. The legal consequences followed swiftly. Marcus Webb filed motions for Daniel's conviction to be overturned based on prosecutorial misconduct and perjured testimony. Federal investigators began examining the opposition research operations that had targeted our family, seeking to identify who had commissioned such extensive surveillance and whether other victims had been similarly affected. Vanessa was arrested within a week on charges ranging from perjury to fraud, and additional charges were expected as the investigation expanded. 6 months later, Daniel's conviction was officially vacated, and he received a formal apology from the state of North Carolina for the wrongful imprisonment he'd endured. The revelation that his case had been compromised by professional deception rather than legitimate witness testimony provided closure not just for our family, but for Margaret Chen's relatives, who deserved to know that justice had been pursued. Honestly, rather than through manufactured evidence, Jonathan and I divorced quietly, with a settlement that reflected his reduced circumstances and complete lack of bargaining power, given the documented evidence of his misconduct. He left Willowmere Springs entirely, seeking employment in a different state where his reputation hadn't been destroyed by his own choices. As for me, I rebuilt my life with the same methodical attention to detail that had made me successful in landscape architecture and had ultimately exposed the conspiracy against my family. The experience had taught me that strength isn't about avoiding betrayal. It's about how you respond when betrayal occurs. Some people become victims permanently, accepting that they've been damaged beyond repair. Others discover that being targeted by sophisticated predators can awaken capabilities they never knew they possessed. Today, as I sit in my new garden designing spaces where honest beauty can flourish, I understand that the most dangerous opponents aren't those who seem obviously threatening. They're the ones who make themselves indispensable while systematically destroying everything you've worked to build. But I also understand that patience, intelligence, and strategic thinking can turn even the most sophisticated deception against itself. The woman who walked into my garden that Saturday afternoon believing she'd won had underestimated the power of a person who refuses to be destroyed quietly. Her confidence in her own cleverness had blinded her to the possibility that some targets possess the determination and resources to fight back with the same level of strategic precision she'd used against them. Sometimes justice isn't swift, but when it's properly orchestrated, it can be absolutely perfect. And sometimes the people who spend their lives hunting others discover too late that they've become the prey in someone else's carefully planned operation. Coming up next, You'll see 2 more stories we handpicked just for you. If this one struck a chord, you're going to love what's next. Tap to keep the journey going.